Hey nerds, what's up? So a few years ago, I had a conversation with a friend, and she said something to the effect of, I will never read fantasy because there is no value in it. I read literary fiction because it tells us about the world at large and it talks about important things, and fantasy doesn't do that, and it's all plot-driven and not character-driven. I might read The Lord of the Rings because it's a classic and it has some literary value, but otherwise I'm not going to read fantasy. So yeah, we're gonna talk about that after the jump. Now, obviously my knee-jerk reaction to this conversation was anger. Now, of course, this wasn't anger I showed anyone because I'm very non-confrontational, I just kept it inside, but it was anger I felt inside. However, whenever I hear an opinion that I just generally don't like, I always think of the Oatmeal's comic about hearing unpopular opinions and our reactions to them and how we should reevaluate that. So I've thought a lot about this conversation over the years, and I've thought about questions like, does fantasy have value outside of entertainment? Does it have good prose? Does it teach us about our world at large? Can it be considered literature? And honestly, after researching it and thinking about this for years and trying to come to an unbiased conclusion, I'm happy to say that yes, fantasy does provide value. So today, I'm coming in defense of the fantasy genre. And I should note that although science fiction and fantasy are two very different genres, and honestly I could make a whole video on that, I will be talking a little bit about sci-fi in this video because public perception tends to lump them together, so it's hard to separate them in some aspects, but for the most part, I'm going to try to solely be focusing on the fantasy genre. Now, the sentiment that my friend expressed is actually a pretty common sentiment. I can't say exactly how common, I can't quantify that because the research on that was very difficult to do, but just as a fantasy reader for decades and having many friends as fantasy readers, we've all experienced that kind of attitude and how fantasy seems to have a bad rep in the literary world or among readers. Now, the most common complaints I generally see are, one, that it's childish, that it's normal and okay to read these things as a middle grader or as a young adult, but as an adult, you should move on. Two, it's all plot-driven and tends to not be well written, and it definitely doesn't have good prose. Three, it's not very serious. It never deals with real-world topics or serious issues. And four, isn't fantasy all just like dragons and elves and orcs and stuff? As one publication so neatly put it, although you'd think fantasy would excite readers' imaginations, the opposite is true. In fact, most readers who used to run into bookstores to find these brain-curdling imaginative stories now find them boring and lacking in prose. Okay. So today, let's defend fantasy. First, it's going to be very helpful if we do a brief history of fantasy. As a quick disclaimer, I should say this brief history is very Western-based and particularly English-oriented. Maybe it's because I'm not a real researcher and so I don't have access to a lot of the scholarly articles that would help me out, but as I tried to do my research, it was very difficult to find fantastical writing origins in other countries and cultures, which is obviously very silly. It's very clear to me that whether through oral or written tradition, that every culture on every continent in every country has probably a rich fantasy history, but based on colonization and just the general bias of Western historical research, this will be a Western-focused fantasy history. So let's start again. Fantasy as a defined genre came much later than the fantastical writings themselves. Some of the first fantasy writings that we can consider are the Greek and Roman myths, which happened circa 700 BC. Now, it may feel uncomfortable to talk about works that started out as religious works, kind of describing gods and the world around them as fantasy, but most scholars agree that the Greek religion as practiced in those days did not survive the 9th century. Now, believers and worshippers of Greek gods are generally known as part of Hellenism, and although they worship Greek gods, I could find no evidence that they really believe in or consider Greek myths to be true. So I think it's fair that we can consider those myths as kind of the early fantasy writings. Epics and legends were next on the list. The oldest surviving English poem is titled Beowulf. I'm sure many of you know it, and it was written around 700 AD. Next, we have Shakespeare in the 1500s and Gulliver's Travels in the 1700s, and then we kind of move on to fairy tales. Now, fairy tales are kind of an important point in this brief history of fantasy because we'll be coming back to it later, so remember that. And the real origin of fairy tales is a little hard to pin down since it probably started mostly as an oral tradition and could have started much earlier than we have recordings for, even though we have famous fairy tales like Grimm fairy tales or Hans Christian Andersen. There was probably stuff going on before then, but this is kind of where they fall in our general timeline. As far as my research shows, the early 19th century is where most scholars agree that the fantasy genre became actually defined as kind of like a topic of literature. And this was actually a little earlier than I expected because it is before The Lord of the Rings, where we might consider it got defined, but it was defined before then. Okay, so let's come up to the 20th century. A big factor in the 20th century were magazine publications that would publish serials of fantasy and science fiction. As recorded, these types of magazines were credited with giving fantasy and other speculative fiction a much wider audience, particularly in Britain and the USA. It was during this time in the mid-20th century that our seminal piece of fantasy work was written, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, this work is widely credited as the work that told publishers that fantasy fiction was a viable money-making thing and really brought the genre into the spotlight and made it more popular and more widely read than ever before. And coming up to today, from LOTR onwards, we've seen a huge explosion in different types of fantasy and what works and what doesn't work, a move away from Europe-centric medieval fantasy into new ideas and exploring new topics, and really just like a great time for the genre, in my opinion. So that ends our very brief history. So thanks for indulging me in that, but that history is important to the wider view of fantasy today and the wider perception of fantasy. First, let's start with fairy tales. Fairy tales are a lot of our first introduction to the fantasy genre when we are very young, whether it be through bedtime stories or just something like Disney movies. Because of this, I think that's a contributing factor to why a lot of adults view fantasy as childish. They're still thinking of the fantasy that they consumed when they were younger. Another thing I think contributes to this is the fact that most of our film adaptations of fantasy novels tend to center around middle grade and YA fantasy. Think Harry Potter, Divergent, A Wrinkle in Time, Twilight, Hunger Games, Ender's Game, Percy Jackson, Narnia, and so on. The two main exceptions to this, I would say, are Game of Thrones, which was still pretty recent if you consider that, and the Marvel franchise, which is funny because I would guess a lot of people don't even consider that they are consuming fantasy when they watch Marvel, even though they are, and we're gonna come back to that later. So I think those things kind of contribute to this idea that fantasy is all childish or made for children. Second, this history is important because we've learned that a lot of fantasy and science fiction was made for magazines, which means they were written differently. They were written to be short and fast-paced and very entertaining and grab a wide audience. So they may not have been focusing as much on prose or maybe important literary aspects. Now, that's a huge generalization, and I think it may have contributed to the perception, but we also have to remember that a lot of fiction published this way is also great works of art. A non-fantasy example we could use is Sherlock Holmes, which was published as a serial and is still widely considered respected today. So it's not always true, but I do think it plays a part. And finally, we come to the double-edged sword that is The Lord of the Rings. On the one hand, The Lord of the Rings is responsible for bringing a legitimacy to fantasy. It showed readers that fantasy could be a classic. It showed it could be well written and poetic and detailed and intelligent, and really the classic fight between good and evil. It's still widely considered a very important piece of literature, and it kind of brings that legitimacy. On the other hand, I feel like The Lord of the Rings popularity and kind of seminalness also can give the wrong impression and pigeonhole fantasy to always being Lord of the Rings, to always being about elves and orcs and dragons. And it's easy for people to be like, well, I don't really like that, and then assume the whole entire fantasy genre is that. They base an entire genre on a single series. And I think this is something that happens a lot with science fiction too. I remember a few years ago, I was with my in-laws and we watched Gattaca, and after it was over, my mother-in-law expressed a lot of surprise about how good the movie was and how thoughtful and interesting. And she said that she kept expecting aliens to show up because after all, it was sci-fi. And I don't know if it was like Star Trek that gave everyone the impression that sci-fi is just like all aliens and weird things, but whatever it is, people seem to not understand that sci-fi and fantasy are often jumping off points to talk about important parts of our society and reality. So let's talk about what the actual definition of fantasy is. Fantasy and sci-fi fall under the title of speculative fiction, and in the Oxford Dictionary, the definition for speculative fiction is a genre of fiction that encompasses works in which the setting is other than the real world, involving supernatural, futuristic, or other imagined elements. I'd like to point out just how general that definition is. It talks about anything imagined counts as speculative fiction. Anything that is not real and is not in our physical world can be considered fantasy. Now, I understand there are some sticky points in trying to decide like what actually is real and what isn't. You know, some people are more superstitious than others and believe in things others don't. Another example would be an atheist would consider the Bible a work of fantasy while a Christian does not. So there are some little bits there, but I think for the most part, there is a wide range of what most people can agree on is real and is not real and is fantasy and is not fantasy. And I think it would surprise a lot of people to find out how many classical works include fantasy elements. My friend's feeling that El-Mohtar was the only respectable classic fantasy actually misses the mark quite a bit. I think she'd be surprised to see how many classical works actually fall under the fantasy category. And don't worry, I obviously counted. I went on to several well-known websites and looked at a lot of 100 classics you must read before you die lists. And I put them together. There were a lot of overlap, but overall, I made a list of 130 books that most everybody agreed were like the books you should read before you die, the books that are good books, the books that are good writing and have value and are important pieces of literary work. And a staggering 42% of them were speculative fiction. Now, if we want to get like really particular, I would say about 36% of them were fantasy, and about 6% of them were magical realism or fantasy light, but still, 42%. So when people say they don't like fantasy or they're disrespecting the fantasy genre, I find that it's because they are working on an extremely limited definition of what fantasy is. I mean, a super famous book like Animal Farm by George Orwell is super respected and is very clearly like allegorical, metaphorical, and makes very important political statements. Guys, it's literally talking animals. It's fantasy. It's an animal society. If there are talking animals, you're reading fantasy. Period. I think a lot of people may confuse high fantasy as all fantasy, which is just clearly not the case. But also, the idea that high fantasy can't have meaning is also very silly. There are tons of books in the non-fantasy genre that use allegories and metaphors as a way to convey meaning. Two very famous ones I think of are The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway and Moby Dick by Herman Melville. These books are clearly metaphors for something else, and so it's kind of silly to think that a fantasy world or a fantasy setting cannot be allegorical or metaphorical for real world things. Like, there's precedence there in other genres, so it can be in the fantasy genre as well, even high fantasy. In some ways, I want to argue that it might be easier to make these points in fantasy because you don't have to be limited by real world things or real world cultures or anything real. You can make up anything you want to get your point across, any setting, any type of people, anything. And so in a lot of ways, it's more freeing way to get your point across. I mean, I can easily think of fantasy books that deal with identity, sexism and gender inequality, LGBTQ plus issues, government, issues with technology, depression, anxiety, and other mental or physical ailments, corruption in government, and the list goes on and on. We must move on from this single definition of fantasy that just isn't true. I honestly think there's something in fantasy for everyone, and I'd almost like to make the claim that fantasy itself can contain almost every other genre underneath it. If you want romance, we got you. If you want historical fiction, we got you. If you want a classic, we got you. If you want literary fic, we got you. If you want religion, we got you. If you want poetry, we've got you. If you want good prose, we've got you. If you want character-driven and not plot-driven, we've got you. If you want to work through things like depression and anxiety and trauma and other things of that nature, we've got you. If you want to deal with the complexities of the world, we've got you. Now, if you really don't like fantasy just because you don't like fantasy, I get it. It's okay. But don't say you don't like fantasy and then disrespect the genre by saying it has no value in literature or no literary comparative value. The truth is that fantasy isn't lacking in sophistication or more childish than any other genre. Every genre has its highlights and its lowlights, and there's always going to be more popcorn reads in a genre and more serious reads in a genre. But claiming that literary fiction is the only genre that really means anything and always has serious books is just silly. Fantasy has the same amount of range and can fulfill those same needs if you want it to. Besides, you actually might be surprised to find out you do enjoy fantasy, or even have enjoyed a lot more fantasy than you thought in the past. Okay, let me know how I did on defending fantasy, and let me know if you've had those kind of comments in the comment section below about people disrespecting our favorite genre. I personally think it's silly, and I loved doing research for this video to kind of prove that we deserve to be respected as a genre. As always, if you like this sort of video, please support me by subscribing, and if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.